Next, from Springfield, we talk one-on-one with Hendrik Rasmussen, who heads a firm that helps American firms sell their products in Europe and helps European firms sell their products in the United States. With over 300,000 Illinoisans now working in jobs that rely on trade with other nations, we'll hear what Mr. Rasmussen says are the key strategies to increase Illinois exports. This runs about 30 minutes. Hendrik Rasmussen, you are involved in trade, as I understand, around the world, but certainly dealing with European nations and facilitating trade between them and Illinois, among other places. And we appreciate you joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you.
As we noted, you have that background, and Governor Quinn is on record as wanting to double the exports of Illinois over the next 4 years. And as we tape this, coincidentally, Caterpillar, one of the major corporations, not merely of Illinois, but of the United States, announced its quarterly earnings, and they were spectacular, due in large part to trade around the world. And we thought it might be very instrumental to remind our viewers how much of Illinois jobs are directly or indirectly tied with trade, and so we appreciate you sharing your insights into that. As we begin, why don't we first just tell us a little bit about yourself so people will know what your background is and how your expertise applies to the topic.
Sure. My name is Hendrik Rasmussen. I'm originally from Denmark, and I came to the United States 11 years ago, became a citizen in 2010. Live in Springfield. I have an office in Chicago. I run a consulting firm called Rasmussen Public Affairs, and I mainly help European companies that are investing in the United States and American companies that are investing in Europe.
When we talk about, people would look at something like Caterpillar and some of the other big corporations. Of course, we know McDonald's is around the world. That's another Illinois corporation. But there are probably thousands of other firms that could be exporting and doing more business with the nations overseas. What's involved in getting those firms that may have a product that Europeans would love to have? How does that work? Let's walk us through, because there may be any number of business owners going, yeah, sure, I'd love to sell overseas, but I don't know where to begin. Where would they begin?
Sure. Well, what I help companies with is sort of the public affairs aspects of their business, basically telling your story. And I think that is the natural first step. If you want to export your product, you have to tell the great story about, why Europeans or Asians should buy your product, why it's better than what they can get from other producers.
And how would one get that word out to the potential consumers of the product?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of different, techniques you can use, obviously, but I think sort of in modern branding, thought leadership is very important. It's important that you are seen as a brand that people buy into, not just a product. So if you can tell a story related to your product, I think that helps sell your product in many cases. Certainly for consumers, I think Apple is a great example of a company that has had tremendous success around the world. Whenever there's a new Apple store opening in a European country, people will be camping outside of the Apple store all night in order to get in. So that's an example of a brand where people buy a story and a lifestyle just as much as a great product.
Do you also get involved, I know do you get involved in the regulatory process and cutting of red tape, or more the telling of the story and the branding?
It's really both. A lot of times companies do face red tape. I've even dealt with companies where, for instance, the European Commission was threatening to ban one of their products. And in that case, storytelling becomes extremely important as well. It's not enough simply to go in and try to influence regulators and legislators directly. You also have to get people with you. If you can get your customers to tell your story for you, to regulators. You're much better off than doing it yourself. Because in that case, you'll have authentic stories about why your product is important, why access to your product is important.
Is there a certain size company that one would have to be before they would want to consider trying to sell their products overseas?
I think in this day and age with the internet, even a one-person company can become an exporter. It depends on what you're exporting, obviously. But there are great examples of small niche companies that have interesting homemade design products, those kind of things. Homemade perfumes or soaps or whatever it is people sell. That can easily, through the internet, start exporting overseas.
And that's an interesting point. I would say this, many Americans would say, well, I can understand going online and maybe there's someone has a website selling sweaters from Maine and I can buy them and they come to Illinois or what. Is it that simple to say I have a website and someone from France or Belgium or wherever orders a product and I can ship it, or is there far more involved? Do you have to get licenses to have the product arrive?
There's obviously regulatory issues around these things, and they will vary from country to country. But I think it's important not to be afraid or let regulatory obstacles discourage you from entering a market. There are obviously professionals in each of these countries, and the rules are different for different industrial sectors, different products in different countries. But I think if you're a little bit systematic about it and get the right people to help you on the ground, a lot of times it's actually not as difficult or as expensive as you would think. And I think still as a one or two person company, you can still make a good deal once you get over those startup hurdles. And if you can tell a good story, you really have opportunities, I think, in the internet age to get the story out and get a lot of traction with customers even abroad.
When you talk to clients in the United States about exporting to European countries, what do you tell them? What is the potential for them?
Well, I think there's great potential, both from a marketing point of view of the product, but also of American companies playing a thought leadership role.
And you're saying
thought
leadership?
Thought leadership, yes. I think it's important, especially for big multinationals, to be very coherent in their communication in foreign markets. Again, Apple is a great example of a company that has told a consistent story and built a lifestyle product and a very solid brand. And I think it's important for a lot of other companies to try to do the same. We see more and more that products that used to be considered, companies that used to be considered part of the old economy are starting to brand themselves as more modern, more technology focused. Everything from telecommunications to manufacturing. You're seeing them stress how much they spend on research and development, how much they are becoming integrated into the global internet-based economy.
We said at the top, you help companies in Europe bring their products here as well as American companies sell overseas. Which is easier for you to accomplish? Is it easier to get Americans to sell theirs overseas or get Europeans to bring their products in?
Well, I think it goes both ways. I have a foot in each camp. I have
I mean, dealing with governments, dealing with red tape. Which is the more cumbersome continent to try to break into?
Well, I think from a regulatory point of view, there's much more regulation and red tape in Europe, at least certain European countries, than you have in the United States. That doesn't mean that the United States is perfect. I would still like to see a lot of barriers to trade removed. I think one of the interesting things that there's talk about now is a transatlantic free trade agreement, which I think could really boost the world economy right now when we're in the middle of a crisis.
I've not heard a lot about that. Tell us where does that stand and what would it do?
So just this week, both David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, and Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, have said they are for a transatlantic free trade area, just like the types of free trade agreements that the U.S.
Kind of like NAFTA, the North
exactly,
America
just
free
like
trade
NAFTA
agreement.
or the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Obama administration is working on right now. I think an equivalent transatlantic free trade area would really boost transatlantic trade. And I think it's important also not to forget how important Europe is to both the United States and Illinois from a trade point of view. We like to talk a lot about BRIC countries and emerging markets.
And by the way, when we say BRIC countries, we mean Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
That's right.
Which are the emerging economies, because historically their economies had been downbeaten. So I'm sorry to interrupt, but I mean the BRIC countries, yes, get a lot of notoriety, but we tend to take for granted or overlook Europe, which I think collectively has a larger population than the United States.
That's right, yes. And collectively is the world's largest economy. And I think obviously there are low growth rates in Europe right now. There's an economic crisis, but still, if you look at it from an Illinois perspective, Canada is obviously the country that takes most of our exports. But right after that is the European Union.
Is that right?
Higher than China, higher than Mexico, if you put all the European countries together.
Explore that a little more. I mean, if you, I don't know if you have any statistics. I didn't ask you, and I didn't ask you beforehand. I don't mean to stump you, but are there any interesting statistics that would illustrate how much trade Illinois does with the European countries that you know offhand?
No, well, I mean, total Illinois exports in 2010 were roughly 50 billion. And that's somewhere around 7–8% of gross state product. 15 billion of that went to Canada, and something like 8 or 9 billion went to the European Union.
So obviously we have, with the largest economy collectively with Europe, there's a great potential to do what the governor's trying to do, is greatly increase our exports. Knowing what you know about the consumers, whether businesses or individual consumers in Europe, what kind of products does Illinois have that Europeans would want to have? I don't know if that's an unfair question, but...
No, I'm sure. I mean, if you look at some of the world-class companies we have in Illinois, I point to the medical sector, for instance. There's a company like Abbott, where you have, it used to be actually that a lot of the world's new medicines were developed in Europe. But during the past 2 decades, research and development in the pharmaceutical sector has moved to the United States. So today it's something like 80% of new drugs are developed in the United States. Well, the Europeans face the same kind of demographic problems.
Aging of the baby boomers.
Exactly, exactly. Actually, it's even worse. The problem is even worse in Europe. And that means, there's going to be a need for a lot of products in, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and so on. And I also think Europe will have to modernize its healthcare sector. There are huge problems in Europe because of socialized medicine, where healthcare delivery is not efficient. If you look at how productive an American doctor is compared to the typical European doctor, it's amazing the difference in productivity, because healthcare is organized more efficiently in the United States. So I think healthcare and healthcare-related products, there's huge potential there. Obviously, Illinois agriculturism is important.
And let me interject with, in the years past, we've heard the terms the Europeans have used of Frankenstein food, because we have modified agricultural products, whether it's seed or whatever. Is that still a primary issue, or has that resolved itself?
No, I mean, that's still an issue, and I do think that there is a growing consumer sentiment. We're also seeing that in the United States, that people want organic products made in a more natural way, if you will. So I think there's in that sector, consumers want originality. And I think the kinds of products that offer that will be successful.
If you were talking directly to the governor's administration, and what kind of advice would you give them as far as their reaching their goal of increasing exports from Illinois?
Well, storytelling, again. I think telling the story about Illinois and great Illinois companies. And by the way, I think it's just as important to increase foreign direct investment into Illinois as it is to increase Illinois exports. And I think actually that's probably where the government and politicians could really make a difference. Because companies that are already in Illinois will do a lot of their own selling. So the issue there is to get more exporters to establish themselves in Illinois if you want to reach that goal. So it's actually marketing Illinois as a great place to locate for exporters, including foreign companies that are coming in and establishing themselves. I've worked on a project with a client, a European client, that came in and acquired several American companies. One of those companies went from, in a very short time span, from exporting 3% of their products to almost half of their products being exported. So here you had a foreign company coming into the United States, buying an American company and turning that American company into an exporter because they brought global expertise. I think it's that kind of investment that Illinois needs to attract in order to reach the goal of doubling exports.
How should Illinois do that? How should it tell its story? Should we have more trade offices in Europe, or in what manner should we accomplish that?
Well, I think that the first thing that's very important to remember is Illinois, if you look at Illinois as an economy, it's the 18th largest economy in the world. Illinois could be a part of the G20.
Is that right? That's a fascinating statistic.
And I think we need to act that way. We need to act not just as a state in the United States, but as a global player. And there are many ways to do that. Obviously, trade representation offices and so on are important. But I think the most crucial thing are the policies that we put in place. Illinois has benefited for many years of having a fairly decent business climate, and actually a fairly fairly low taxes when you look at it from a business perspective. Mm-hmm. The unfortunate news is the recent tax hike actually was a huge setback for Illinois. I think we went from, if you look at the Tax Foundation's latest numbers that just came out this week, we went from being the 16th best tax climate in the United States from business perspective to number 28. And that is the state that has dropped the most since last year's rankings. We benefit obviously from having a global city like Chicago, but I think the tax hike will also hurt Chicago. One of the most important aspects of competitiveness when you look at rankings of global financial centers is the tax environment. So I think keeping taxes low is crucial and probably the most important thing that policymakers in Illinois can do.
This coming May, we're going to have a great meeting of the world leaders in Europe, or in Chicago. And I would imagine that you would say that that's one of the great opportunities for Illinois to tell its story. One, are you involved in that in any way? And secondly, whether you are or not involved in that meeting in any way, what would you tell, again, the state officials or Chicago officials? What should they be doing now to best showcase Illinois as a good place to do business?
Well, I think it's important, obviously. I mean, just that we got the summit, I think, was a great
coup,
yeah. and accomplishment. And I think, as you say, it is an opportunity with international media being present and so on to highlight what Illinois can do. And again, the most important thing is for Illinois leaders, whether it be the mayor of Chicago or the governor, state policymakers, business leaders, and so on, to act as the 18th largest economy in the world.
You know, I just wanted to interject. I was going to say, in producing the Illinois Channel coverage, a lot of times people kind of diminish what Illinois is, I think, in their own mind, Illinoisans. And I say to them, don't think of Illinois as a state, because you don't. A better way to know what it does is to think of it as a nation. We have almost, we have embassies, only we call them consulates, and there's something like 50 or 60 consulates in Chicago representing other nations. We have an army, the National Guard, that goes overseas and fights. And we are, in many ways, a world economy. We have some of the biggest corporations, as we mentioned, in the entire world located here in Illinois, from McDonald's and Abbott Labs and John Deere, Caterpillar, ADM, the list goes on. So too many times I think we here in Illinois lament our current fiscal problems, but we don't look at the assets and what we can do to really turn that around and rebuild the economic activity.
That's exactly right. And I think storytelling is key, because if Illinoisans don't act as if we are the 18th largest economy in the world, we're not going to stay the 18th largest economy in the world. Mm-hmm. So leadership is important, but grassroots activism and grassroots attitudes are also important. If we don't believe in ourselves, it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy where businesses will leave Illinois. I think we're already seeing some bad signs. It just came out that last year, Illinois was the state in the United States that had the largest increase in unemployment. 46 other states in unemployment actually decreased.
Which shows there's still a lot of work to be done. Relative to the consulates in Chicago, do you work with them? Would you recommend some businesses here, if they're looking to export to a particular country, to go to the consulate? Again, let's, would that be a starting point? And would you recommend, we talk about Europe, but Europe is made up of different nations. Maybe include in your answer, are there certain countries, if you were advising a client, start here because it's a lot easier to get started, and don't start there because that'll be the toughest one to get your footprint?
Sure. Well, on your first point, I think the consulates are great partners, both for Illinois in terms of attracting foreign companies, and for people that are interested in exporting to those countries, and maybe even opening offices overseas. Mm-hmm. I think commerce is clearly becoming a much more important part of international diplomacy. So what I've seen is a lot of the consulates are much more aggressive, and the embassies are much more aggressive on the commercial side. They're maintaining their focus on policy and politics, obviously, but there's much more promotion of trade involved in international diplomacy these days. On your second point, on Europe specifically, and maybe I'm biased because I'm originally from a smaller country, but I think one of the mistakes that a lot of people make when they look overseas is they focus on the big markets, and that's important, obviously, because in Germany you have a big market of 80 million people. But if you look at Europe as a whole, there are a lot of smaller countries where it's much easier to set up business operations. Certainly, the Scandinavian countries are pretty streamlined when it comes to that. It's fairly easy to set up operations. They also
have a base there. Huh?
Exactly.
And you could have your sales office, or people operate, as an example, out of Denmark and then just drive or wherever,
Exactly. No, so if you look at an airport like the Copenhagen International Airport, for instance, it's a major hub in Europe, and you can get to anywhere. And you also shouldn't underestimate, the relatively easy access you have to political leaders in small countries compared to big countries. Because in a small country, you are a big player in a small country, and I think you'd rather be a big player in a small country than a small player in a big country.
Mm-hmm. When we look, obviously, over the last 25 years or so, it's hard to believe it's been that long since the Berlin Wall came down. How are those countries faring? Are the old Warsaw Pact nations, are they, where would you put them in as far as doing business? Are they easier to deal with, harder to deal with? It's almost like in my lifetime when we grew up, we talked about Europe, it was just understood. You're talking about Western Europe, and the rest was like a gray cloud. Now there's a whole new Europe out there. Where do they stand in doing trade with?
Well, they have great tax climates. A lot of them have flat taxes, fairly simple structures. A country like Estonia, for instance, have all of their government online and extremely streamlined. I think there are some other countries where they still need to work on their civil service, and there's still a fair amount of red tape that you need to overcome. But overall, I'm very optimistic about that region, and I certainly think it's a place that people should look for future growth.
When we talk about Europe, obviously, unlike the United States, where we speak English across the board, you have to deal with a host of different languages. What do you tell American clients? How difficult is the language barrier to deal with, and what's the best way? When I grew up again, and we went to Europe back in the 60s or 70s, it was more pronounced. These days, with modern communications and all, I don't know if the language barrier is as severe as it used to be.
Not from a pure business point of view. Most European business people speak English, so that's not an issue. I think that the challenge comes when you're talking about communication. You obviously need to communicate in the local language if you're selling your market, selling your product on a mass market in a foreign country. It needs to be the local language, and there are all sorts of issues there. How do you translate your branding strategy from the United States that's targeted at American consumers into a branding strategy that works with a different audience, but that doesn't contradict the kind of overall branding story that you're trying to tell on a global basis?
And we've heard different horror stories in the past where somebody's trying to market and communicate and brand, and they come up with some phrase that is an insult in a different country. Is that one of the services? I mean, it seems like a small thing, but if you do it wrong, it's a big problem. Is that one of the kind of services that you bring to the table for your clients, that you understand the cultures of Europe and as well as what the needs are of the clients here in the United States?
Yeah, that's my niche. And a lot of what I do is also, just from a project management point of view, deal with the different cultures that you deal with. If you were sitting in a corporate headquarters in America, and you have certain expectations that need to be met, you often run into cultural barriers at all sorts of levels, just in terms of how quickly you can expect results, how things are communicated, working hours, very, very simple things that can turn into conflicts unless you have someone to manage them, who can translate between the different cultures.
There's many issues we could continue to talk about, but before we run out of time, if someone is watching this and wants to get more information, how either do they get a hold of you, or what other sources of information? Are there websites or something that someone could start with? I think a lot of people are still probably intimidated by the process and wouldn't know where to even take the first step.
Well, if they want to get in touch with me, they can go to rasmussenpa.com, which is my website, and they can get all my contact details there, and I'd be happy to talk to them. I also think, as I mentioned, the foreign consulates are great resources. U.S. Department of Commerce, U.S. Chamber of Commerce are also great resources, both in terms of overall statistics on trade, and also trade promotion advice for people that want to go overseas.
Okay, well, Hendrik Rasmussen, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us, maybe especially as we get closer to the summit coming up in May. And by the way, which summit is that for the viewers who probably haven't paid too much attention, that this is going to be a very big deal coming up May 20th and 21st in Chicago.
It's the NATO summit.
And so we'll have, how many different leaders would be attending that? And
I believe we'll have 28 to 30 different heads of government and international organizations there.
It's going to be one of the bigger events to come to Illinois in many decades, I would think.
Absolutely.
Well, again, thank you so much for joining us, and we appreciate you sharing your insights.
Thank you.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.